I survived the car accident, and my brother said, "We already spent the insurance money." I woke up in the hospital 3 months after the accident, with tubes running out of my arms and a ventilator hose taped to my face. The first thing I saw was my brother Derek standing by the window looking out at the parking lot instead of at me. A nurse noticed my eyes were open and rushed over, calling for the doctor while checking my vitals. Derek turned around slowly, and his face went completely white like he'd seen a ghost. He didn't run to my bedside or grab my hand or show any relief that his younger brother had just woken from a coma. He just stood there frozen with his mouth hanging open. The doctor came in talking about miraculous recovery and brain function tests. But I couldn't focus on his words because Derek looked absolutely terrified instead of happy. They removed the breathing tube 2 days later, and my voice came out scratchy and weak when I finally asked Derek what happened. He pulled his chair closer to the hospital bed and explained that my car got hit by a semi-truck on the interstate 3 months ago. The impact was so severe that the paramedics called my time of death at the scene, but then found a pulse and rushed me to the trauma center. I'd been in a coma ever since, with doctors saying my chances of waking up were less than 5%. Insurance had covered the hospital bills so far, but they were talking about moving me to long-term care facilities because nobody expected me to recover. Derek's hands shook as he talked, and he kept looking at the door like he wanted to leave. I asked about Mom and Dad, and his face went even paler. They'd flown in from Arizona immediately after the accident, but had to go back after 2 weeks when Dad's health got bad. They'd been calling every day for updates. Something felt wrong about how Derek was acting. My older brother and I had always been close, growing up as best friends who told each other everything. But now he couldn't meet my eyes, and his stories about the past 3 months felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced what to say. I asked him about my apartment and my job at the consulting firm where I'd worked as a financial analyst. Derek said the company had been really supportive at first, sending flowers and calling for updates. But after 6 weeks, when it became clear I might never wake up, they'd had to fill my position. My apartment lease had ended, and Derek moved all my stuff into storage. He'd been handling everything, he assured me, taking care of all my affairs while I was unconscious. The way he said it made my stomach turn over even though I couldn't explain why. Physical therapy started the next week and was brutal. My muscles had atrophied so badly that I couldn't walk more than a few steps without collapsing. The therapist said 3 months in bed had essentially erased years of fitness, and I'd have to rebuild everything from scratch. My insurance covered 30 days of inpatient rehab, and the social worker explained I'd need to apply for disability benefits after that since returning to work anytime soon was impossible. She helped me fill out paperwork on a tablet, her voice gentle as she explained how the accident had changed my life completely. I'd had a promising career and an active social life, and now I was starting over from zero. Derek visited every day during rehab, bringing me clothes and toiletries, but something in his energy felt off. He'd check his phone constantly and leave quickly whenever the doctors came in to discuss my progress and prognosis. After 2 weeks of rehab, I could walk to the bathroom on my own, and my speech had returned to almost normal. The brain fog was lifting, and I started thinking clearly about practical matters like money and living arrangements. I asked Derek about my bank accounts, and he got that same terrified look from the first day I woke up. He said we needed to talk about finances, but not here at the hospital where nurses kept interrupting. He suggested waiting until I got discharged and settled somewhere more private. The way he avoided eye contact made alarm bells go off in my head. I'd always been good with money, keeping detailed budgets and building up savings. Before the accident, I'd had about $30,000 in my checking and savings accounts, plus a decent 401k from my job. Derek kept changing the subject whenever I brought up accessing my accounts online. Discharge day came, and Derek picked me up in his SUV. I asked where we were going since my apartment was gone, and he said I'd be staying with him and his wife Mallory for a while until I got back on my feet. Their house was in the suburbs about 30 minutes from the hospital, a nice 2-story place they'd bought 3 years ago. Mallory met us at the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She'd set up the guest room for me with fresh sheets and a TV, acting like a gracious host while something cold radiated from her body language. She disappeared upstairs after showing me the room, and I heard their bedroom door close firmly. Derek helped me get settled, then said we needed to have that talk about finances. We sat at his kitchen table, and he pulled out a folder stuffed with papers. The life insurance policy sat on top of the stack. I stared at my own name on the document, a policy for $500,000 that my company had provided as part of my benefits package. Derek explained that when the paramedics declared me dead at the accident scene, the insurance company had been notified. By the time I arrived at the hospital with a pulse, the death notification was already in the system. The hospital corrected the error immediately, but there was a gap of about 6 hours where I was officially deceased in multiple databases. During my coma, Derek had filed a claim as my beneficiary since I'd listed him when I set up the policy years ago. The insurance company investigated and found the initial death declaration, and with doctors saying I'd likely never wake up, they'd approved the payout. Derek received $500,000 4 weeks after my accident. My hands went numb, listening to him explain this. I asked what he meant by received, and Derek's face crumbled. He said the money hit his account 6 weeks ago, and he'd thought I was never waking up based on what every doctor told him. The payout was supposed to help him deal with funeral costs and my final affairs. But then, there were other expenses that came up, things he'd been putting off. He and Mallory had been drowning in credit card debt, about $80,000 from medical bills when Mallory had a complicated surgery 2 years ago. They'd been making minimum payments and getting buried deeper every month. When the insurance money came through, Derek said he made a decision to pay off their debt completely. It felt like using the money for something important, rather than just sitting on it while I was in a coma, possibly dying anyway. His voice got defensive as he explained his reasoning, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. I asked how much of the $500,000 was left. Derek couldn't look at me when he admitted they'd spent all of it, every single dollar. Not just on the credit cards, but on other things too. They'd bought a new car because Mallory's was breaking down constantly. They'd done some home repairs that couldn't wait anymore, like replacing the roof and fixing the foundation cracks. They'd taken a vacation to Hawaii because Derek said he needed to process his grief over losing his brother. They'd bought new furniture and updated their kitchen. He rattled off expense after expense while I sat there feeling like someone had punched me in the chest. That money was supposed to be mine. It was life insurance meant to provide for my beneficiaries after my death, but I hadn't died. I'd survived, and now I had nothing, while my brother had used my near death to clear his debts and upgrade his lifestyle. I asked if he'd talked to a lawyer about whether he had to pay the money back. Derek's face told me he already knew the answer. He'd consulted with an attorney 2 weeks ago when I first woke up and was clearly going to survive. The lawyer said that technically Derek received the money legally, since the insurance company approved the claim based on the death declaration. But ethically and morally, the money should be returned now that I was alive. The insurance company could potentially sue to recover the funds, or I could sue Derek directly. Either way, the money was supposed to come back because the payout was based on a mistaken death declaration. But Derek had already spent everything, and even if a court ordered him to repay it, he'd need years to come up with $500,000. He'd essentially stolen my insurance money and gambling that I'd never wake up to find out. The rage that hit me was so intense, I couldn't speak for a full minute. Derek kept apologizing and saying he'd thought I was brain dead and never coming back. Every doctor had told him to prepare for the worst. The odds of me waking up had been less than 5%. He'd made a decision based on information that seemed certain at the time, but none of that changed the fact that I was alive and broke while he'd spent my money on vacations and home improvements. I asked him how he planned to fix this, and Derek said he'd start making payments to me every month, whatever he could afford after his mortgage and bills, maybe $500 or $1,000 monthly, until he'd repaid everything. At that rate, it would take him 40 years to repay $500,000, and we both knew he'd never actually do it. This was him asking for forgiveness, disguised as a repayment plan he had no intention of following through on. I spent that first night in Derek's guest room staring at the ceiling and trying to process what my life had become. 3 months ago, I'd been a successful financial analyst with savings and a career and independence. Now I was unemployed, disabled, broke, and homeless, staying in the house my brother bought with my own insurance money. The betrayal burned worse than any physical pain from the accident. Derek had been my closest family member besides our parents, the person I trusted more than anyone. And the second he thought I was gone, he'd cashed in on my death and spent everything on himself. I pulled out my phone and started researching insurance fraud and unjust enrichment laws. The legal websites confirmed what Derek's lawyer had probably told him. I had a case, but actually collecting the money would be nearly impossible since he'd already spent it all. The next morning, Mallory made breakfast and acted like everything was normal. She asked how I slept and if I needed anything, playing the role of concerned sister-in-law. I asked her directly if she knew where the money came from when they paid off their credit cards. Her face went red, and she stammered that Derek had told her it was from his brother's life insurance, that I was brain dead and wouldn't recover. She'd felt terrible about it, but trusted Derek's judgment about using the money. I asked if she felt terrible enough to sell the new car or cancel their kitchen renovation to help pay me back. Mallory's sympathy vanished, and she said they'd made decisions based on the information they had at the time. She wasn't going to apologize for accepting help when they desperately needed it. Her tone made it clear she viewed the money as rightfully theirs now, a lucky break that had solved their financial problems. The fact that I'd survived was inconvenient, but didn't change her belief that they deserved to keep what they'd gotten. I called my parents that afternoon and explained everything. My mom started crying immediately and said she'd fly back out to help me figure things out. My dad's voice got hard and angry when I told him Derek had spent the insurance money. He said he'd call Derek directly and demand he make this right, but I knew my parents couldn't actually fix this. They were retired on fixed incomes, living in a modest apartment in Arizona. They didn't have hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting around to give me. And even if they did, it wouldn't change the fundamental betrayal of what Derek had done. My brother had looked at my comatose body in that hospital bed and seen dollar signs instead of family. He'd mourned me while simultaneously planning how to spend my death benefit. Every tear he'd supposedly cried had been fake because he'd been too busy calculating how much debt he could clear. The insurance company called me 2 days later. A claims investigator named Philip Kraus explained that they'd flagged my case when the hospital corrected my status from deceased to alive. They'd been monitoring my recovery, and now that I was clearly going to survive, they wanted to discuss recovering the funds paid out in error. Philip said this was an unusual situation, but the law was clear. Life insurance pays out upon death, and since I hadn't died, the payment was made in error and needed to be returned. The problem was that my brother had already spent the money and claimed he couldn't pay it back. The insurance company could sue Derek to recover the funds, but that would take years and legal fees. Or I could sue Derek myself, since the money was rightfully mine. Either way, Philip said I should consult with an attorney who specialized in insurance disputes and family law. I met with an attorney named Vanessa Thorne 2 days later. Her office was downtown in a tall building with a view of the river, and her credentials covered an entire wall. She listened to my story without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she sat back and asked if I understood how difficult this case would be. Not legally, she explained, because the law was completely on my side. Derek had received money based on my death, and I wasn't dead, so the money should be returned. Any judge would agree with that basic premise. The problem was enforcement. Derek had no assets beyond his house and his income, both of which were protected up to certain limits. Even if I won a judgment, actually collecting $500,000 from someone who'd already spent it would take decades. She could file a lawsuit tomorrow, but I needed to understand I might never see that money. Vanessa explained my options clearly. I could sue Derek for the full amount plus damages and legal fees. The lawsuit would destroy our relationship permanently and likely tear the family apart. Or I could try to negotiate a settlement where Derek agreed to pay me back over time with a formal payment plan and consequences if he defaulted. That option preserved some family connection, but meant accepting I'd never get the full amount back. Or I could walk away, cut Derek out of my life, and try to rebuild without the money. Each option had major drawbacks, and none of them gave me what I actually wanted, which was to go back to before the accident, when I had my health and my career and my savings. Vanessa said I needed to think about what kind of justice I wanted, financial recovery or emotional closure, because I probably couldn't get both. I went back to Derek's house that night and told him I was hiring Vanessa to file a lawsuit. His face went pale and he started talking fast about how that would ruin him and Mallory. If I sued, they'd have to declare bankruptcy and might lose their house. Their credit would be destroyed for years. He begged me to reconsider, to work something out between brothers without getting lawyers involved. I asked him why I should care about protecting his credit when he'd stolen $500,000 from me. Derek said he hadn't stolen anything because he'd legitimately received the insurance payout. I corrected him and said he'd received money that was paid based on a false premise, my death. The only reason he got that money was because everyone thought I was dead. And now that I wasn't dead, keeping the money was theft, regardless of how he tried to justify it. Mallory appeared from upstairs and joined Derek in begging me not to file a lawsuit. She said they'd do anything to make this right, but being sued would destroy everything they'd built together. I asked what she thought was fair, and she suggested I move on and accept that the money was gone. She actually said those words. You need to move on and accept reality. Like I was being unreasonable for wanting my own insurance money back after surviving a catastrophic accident. I asked if she'd accept that reality if our positions were reversed, if her sibling had taken her life insurance money and told her to move on. Mallory said that was different because she would never put her sibling in that position. The circular logic was infuriating. They'd wronged me, but I was the bad guy for not accepting being wronged gracefully. I called Vanessa the next morning and told her to file the lawsuit. She said she'd have the papers ready within a week, and that I should prepare for my relationship with Derek to get very ugly, very fast. I also called my parents and told them what I'd decided. My mom said she understood, but was heartbroken that her sons were about to go to war against each other. My dad said Derek deserved to be sued, and he'd testify on my behalf if needed. The family was fracturing exactly how Vanessa predicted, with everyone picking sides. Derek's wife's family apparently thought I was being vindictive and cruel by suing my own brother. My aunts and uncles were split. Some saying Derek should pay me back, and others saying I should be grateful to be alive and not focus on money. As if surviving a near-fatal accident meant I should accept being robbed by family. Derek kicked me out of his house 3 days later. He said my presence was causing too much stress for Mallory, and they needed me to find somewhere else to stay. I had nowhere to go, and barely any money, still unable to work due to my physical limitations. I ended up at a homeless shelter downtown, sleeping on a cot in a room with 50 other men. The shelter staff was kind but overwhelmed, and every night I lay there listening to other people's problems and thinking about how my brother was sleeping in a nice house with a new kitchen paid for with my life insurance money. I'd survived impossible odds, woken from a coma that should have killed me, and this was my reward. Homeless and broke while my family argued about whether I deserved basic justice. The lawsuit moved slowly through the court system. Vanessa filed the complaint, and Derek hired his own attorney, who filed a motion to dismiss. That motion argued that Derek had no legal obligation to return the money since the insurance company paid the claim voluntarily. The judge denied the motion and ordered the case to proceed to discovery. That meant both sides could request documents and take depositions. Derek's lawyer requested my medical records and employment history, trying to build an argument that I'd never actually earned back the money I lost. Vanessa countered by requesting Derek's financial records showing exactly how he'd spent the insurance payout. Every court filing cost money I didn't have, and Vanessa agreed to work on contingency, meaning she'd take a percentage of whatever we recovered. She believed in the case enough to risk not getting paid if we lost. Discovery revealed the full scope of Derek's spending. He'd paid off $80,000 in credit card debt the week after receiving the insurance money. He'd bought a $50,000 SUV in cash. He'd spent $30,000 on the Hawaii vacation, staying at luxury resorts and eating at expensive restaurants while supposedly grieving his comatose brother. He'd spent $70,000 on home improvements, including the new kitchen, roof repairs, and landscaping. He'd put $100,000 into investment accounts for himself and Mallory. He'd given $20,000 to his church as a charitable donation, probably to ease his guilty conscience. The rest had gone to smaller expenses like new clothes, electronics, and furniture. Every dollar carefully tracked in bank statements that showed exactly how Derek had systematically spent money that wasn't his. Vanessa was furious when she reviewed the discovery documents. She said the vacation expenses alone showed Derek's true character. He'd told everyone he was devastated by my condition, but his credit card statements showed him drinking expensive wine and getting couples massages while I was in a coma fighting for my life. She'd seen a lot of terrible family betrayals in her practice, but this case made her genuinely angry. We scheduled Derek's deposition for 6 weeks out, and Vanessa said she was going to make him explain every purchase under oath. She wanted him to have to say out loud that he'd spent my death benefit on luxury vacations and kitchen renovations while I was unconscious in a hospital bed. The deposition was about building our case, but it was also about making Derek face what he'd done. My disability benefits got approved around the same time. The monthly payment was barely enough to cover rent at a cheap studio apartment and basic expenses. I moved out of the shelter and into a rundown building near the industrial district where rent was $400 a month for a place with stained carpet and a bathroom that smelled like mildew. But it was mine, and it had a door that locked. I started physical therapy again using Medicaid coverage, slowly rebuilding strength and mobility. The therapist said I'd probably never get back to where I was before the accident, that there was permanent damage from being immobile for 3 months. My career as a financial analyst was essentially over because I couldn't sit at a desk for long periods without pain, and I had cognitive issues from the brain injury that made complex calculations difficult. Derek's deposition was scheduled for a Monday morning at Vanessa's office. I attended, even though I didn't have to, sitting in the conference room while a court reporter set up her equipment. Derek arrived with his lawyer, looking exhausted and defeated. He wouldn't make eye contact with me as everyone took their seats. Vanessa started with basic background questions, establishing Derek's relationship to me and the timeline of the accident. Then she moved into the insurance claim, asking Derek to explain when he filed it and what he was told. Derek admitted he'd filed the claim 2 weeks after the accident, when doctors said my prognosis was poor. The insurance company investigated and approved the payout based on the initial death declaration and the medical assessment that I'd likely never recover. Vanessa asked Derek when he received the money, and he gave the exact date, 6 weeks after my accident. She asked what his first thought was when he saw $500,000 hit his bank account. Derek said he'd felt relieved because he'd been drowning in debt and stressed about money for years. Vanessa asked if he'd thought about saving the money in case I woke up, and Derek stammered that every doctor said I wouldn't wake up. She asked if he'd considered that even a 5% chance meant I might survive, and Derek said he'd made his decision based on the most likely outcome. Vanessa asked him to walk through each major purchase, and Derek had to explain on the record buying a new car and taking a vacation to Hawaii while his brother was in a coma. His voice got quieter with each answer as he realized how bad it sounded. The worst part of the deposition came when Vanessa asked Derek if he'd ever intended to return the money if I survived. Derek hesitated, and his lawyer objected, but Vanessa rephrased the question. She asked if Derek had discussed with his wife what they'd do if I woke up. Derek admitted they'd talked about it briefly and decided they'd deal with that situation if it happened. Vanessa asked what deal with it meant, and Derek said they'd figured they could work out a payment plan or something. She asked if he'd stopped spending the money once I woke up, and Derek had to admit he'd continued making purchases even after I regained consciousness. The deposition lasted 4 hours, and by the end, Derek looked like he'd been put through a wood chipper. Vanessa had built a devastating record of his choices and his complete disregard for my rights. The trial got scheduled for 9 months after I filed the lawsuit. In that time, I focused on rebuilding my life as much as possible. I found part-time work doing bookkeeping for a small business, basic data entry that I could handle despite my limitations. The owner was understanding about my schedule and let me work from home when I needed to. The money wasn't much, but combined with my disability benefits, I could cover rent and food and basic expenses. I attended physical therapy religiously and regained most of my mobility, though I still had chronic pain that doctors said would probably never go away completely. The accident had left permanent damage that I'd carry for the rest of my life. Every morning I woke up in pain was a reminder of what Derek's betrayal cost me. Derek tried to reach out several times during those months. He'd call and leave voicemails saying he wanted to talk, that we were brothers, and shouldn't be fighting like this. He'd send text messages saying he was sorry and wanted to work things out. I never responded because there was nothing to say. He'd made his choices and now had to live with the consequences. My parents tried to mediate, suggesting we all sit down together and find a compromise. But I was done compromising. Derek had taken everything from me when I was at my most vulnerable, and no amount of family pressure would make me pretend that was okay. My mom cried on the phone saying she was losing both her sons over this, and I told her she still had both sons. She'd just lost the illusion that Derek was someone he wasn't. The trial lasted 3 days. The courtroom was small and sterile, with fluorescent lights that made everyone look sickly. Vanessa presented our case methodically, walking through the timeline and the evidence. She showed the jury Derek's bank statements with his purchases highlighted. She played portions of his deposition where he admitted continuing to spend the money after I woke up. She brought in medical experts who testified about my prognosis and my permanent disabilities from the accident. She established that Derek knew there was a chance I'd survive but spent the money anyway. Then she put me on the stand and had me explain what it felt like to wake up broke and homeless while my brother lived in comfort paid for with my life insurance money. I kept my composure until she asked about my relationship with Derek before the accident, and talking about how close we used to be made my voice crack. Derek's lawyer tried to paint him as a victim too, someone who'd made a difficult decision based on medical advice. He called witnesses who testified about Derek's dedication while I was in the coma, visiting me every day and talking to doctors. He brought in a financial expert who argued that Derek's debt was so severe that using the insurance money was a rational choice. He tried to make the jury sympathize with Derek's position, facing what seemed like certain loss of his brother while drowning financially. But Vanessa destroyed that narrative on cross-examination by showing that Derek had taken luxury vacations and made unnecessary purchases. If he'd really been in financial crisis, he would have used the money carefully. Instead, he'd treated it like lottery winnings and spent lavishly while I fought for my life. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they came back, the forewoman read the verdict, finding Derek liable for unjust enrichment and ordering him to repay the full $500,000 plus interest and damages. The total judgment came to almost $600,000, including my legal fees and compensation for my suffering. Vanessa had argued for punitive damages, but the jury decided the actual amount was punishment enough. Derek's face went white as the verdict was read, and Mallory started crying in the gallery behind him. The judge asked if Derek understood the judgment, and he nodded numbly. Then the judge asked how he planned to pay it, and Derek's lawyer said they'd need to discuss bankruptcy options. I sat there feeling hollow instead of victorious, because I knew what this meant. Even with a judgment, I'd probably never see that money. Derek filed for bankruptcy 3 weeks after the verdict. His lawyer argued that the judgment made it impossible for him to pay his debts, and he needed protection from creditors. The bankruptcy court could discharge most of Derek's debts, but couldn't discharge the judgment against me because it was based on fraud. That meant Derek still legally owed me the money, but the bankruptcy would tie everything up for months or years while the court sorted out his assets. Vanessa explained this was a common tactic, using bankruptcy to delay payment and make it too expensive for me to keep pursuing collection. Derek's house was protected under homestead exemption, and his income was protected up to certain limits. The court could garnish his wages, but only by a small percentage, meaning I'd get maybe a few $100s per month toward a $600,000 judgment. The bankruptcy proceedings dragged on for a full year. During that time, Derek and Mallory sold their house and moved to a smaller place, claiming financial hardship. They'd bought the house with my insurance money and now got to keep the profit from the sale, using it as a down payment on the new place. The bankruptcy judge allowed it because technically their equity was protected. I attended every hearing, watching Derek claim poverty while preserving his assets through legal loopholes. Vanessa fought hard, but the system was designed to protect debtors, and Derek knew how to work every angle. By the end of the bankruptcy, the court ordered Derek to pay me $1,000 per month toward the judgment. At that rate, it would take him 50 years to pay me back. We both knew he'd find ways to reduce or avoid even those payments. I rebuilt my life slowly and deliberately over the next 2 years. The part-time bookkeeping job turned into a full-time position when the business expanded. The owner promoted me to office manager with a small salary increase. I moved to a better apartment in a safer neighborhood. I continued physical therapy and learned to manage my chronic pain through medication and exercise. I made new friends who didn't know anything about my accident or my family drama. I dated occasionally, though relationships were difficult when I had to explain my limitations and my financial situation. Most people didn't understand how someone could win a $600,000 judgment and still be struggling to pay rent. The gap between what I was owed and what I'd actually receive felt like its own kind of disability. My parents tried to maintain relationships with both sons, but it was awkward and painful. They'd visit me in my city and then visit Derek in his, never mentioning the other brother. My mom would slip and reference something Derek said, then catch herself and change subjects. My dad stopped pretending there wasn't a problem and openly said he was disappointed in Derek's choices. At family gatherings for holidays, Derek and I were never in the same room. Someone would always schedule separate celebrations, or we'd take turns attending. The family fractured permanently around the wound Derek created when he spent my insurance money. Some relatives sided with him, saying I was being cruel by pursuing the judgment so aggressively. Others sided with me, saying Derek deserved everything he got. Most just stayed out of it and mourned the loss of family unity. Derek's monthly payments started showing up in my account after the bankruptcy concluded. Exactly $1,000 on the first of each month, electronically transferred, so we never had to interact. I watched the balance on the judgment decrease by a tiny amount each month, a number so large I'd never see it fully repaid in my lifetime. The payments felt like adding a cup of water to an empty swimming pool, technically progress but functionally meaningless. I calculated that I'd be 73 years old when the judgment was fully paid, assuming Derek never missed a payment and never died or disabled himself. The math was depressing enough that I tried not to think about it. Instead, I focused on building a life that wasn't defined by what Derek took from me. 3 years after the accident, I got a call from Philip Kraus at the insurance company. He said they'd been following my case and watching Derek's bankruptcy proceedings. The company had initially written off the $500,000 as a loss, but now they were considering a different approach. Philip explained that insurance companies sometimes buy judgments from plaintiffs who are having trouble collecting. They'd offer me a lump sum, maybe 30 or 40% of what I was owed, in exchange for transferring the judgment to them. The insurance company would then pursue Derek themselves with more resources and more aggressive tactics. I'd get immediate money, but give up the right to the full amount. Philip said I should think about it carefully because once I sold the judgment, I'd never get more than whatever they paid me. I discussed the offer with Vanessa, and she said it was a reasonable option given my circumstances. Derek was clearly never going to pay me back in full, and getting $200,000 now might be better than getting $1,000 per month for decades. With that money, I could pay off debts, build savings, maybe even go back to school and retrain for a career that accommodated my disabilities. The insurance company would pursue Derek aggressively, potentially forcing him to sell assets or garnish more of his income. They had legal resources I couldn't afford and no emotional attachment that would make them ease up. I'd be passing Derek's punishment to someone who would really make him pay, but I'd also be accepting I'd never get full justice, never recover everything he took from me. I spent a week thinking about the insurance company's offer. Part of me wanted to refuse out of principle, to hold on to the judgment and make Derek pay every dollar he owed. But another part of me was exhausted from fighting and wanted to move forward with my life. Holding on to anger and pursuing Derek forever hadn't made me happy or successful. It had kept me chained to the worst moment of my life, defined by what was taken rather than what I could build. I called Philip and negotiated. The insurance company eventually agreed to pay me $250,000 for the judgment, about 40% of what I was owed. I signed the papers transferring everything to them and watched the money hit my account 3 days later. It felt like freedom and defeat at the same time. Derek called me a week after the judgment transferred, his voice panicked on my voicemail. The insurance company had sent him a letter notifying him they now held the judgment and would be pursuing much more aggressive collection. They'd already filed paperwork to garnish more of his income and put liens on his assets. Derek begged me to call him back, saying we could work something out if I'd just talk to him. I deleted the voicemail without responding. Whatever happened to Derek now was between him and the insurance company. I'd made my peace with never getting full justice and sold my right to his punishment. The $250,000 in my account was more money than I'd seen since before the accident. It wouldn't restore my health or my career or the 3 years I'd spent fighting, but it would let me build something new. I paid off all my debts first and set up a modest emergency fund. Then I enrolled in online courses to update my skills and certifications. My disabilities made traditional employment difficult, but I could build a freelance career working from home on my own schedule. I started taking on bookkeeping clients beyond my office manager job, building a side business that might eventually replace my primary income. I moved to a nicer apartment with good light and no mildew smell. I bought a reliable used car so I didn't have to take the bus everywhere. Small improvements that felt massive after years of struggle. I donated $10,000 to the hospital that saved my life after the accident, funding a program that helped other trauma survivors with rehabilitation costs. Giving that money away felt better than anything I'd spent on myself. My parents noticed the change in me when they visited 6 months after the settlement. My mom said I seemed lighter, less angry, and bitter. My dad asked if I'd forgiven Derek, and I told him honestly that I hadn't forgiven anything. But I'd stopped letting Derek's betrayal define my entire existence. Forgiveness was for people who showed remorse and tried to make things right. Derek had shown neither. He'd fought me in court, declared bankruptcy to avoid paying, and only expressed regret when facing consequences. But I'd decided my healing wasn't dependent on Derek's punishment or redemption. I could build a good life, whether or not he ever acknowledged what he'd done. My dad nodded and said that was wisdom he wished he'd learned at my age, instead of carrying grudges for decades. The insurance company pursued Derek relentlessly for the next year. They garnished 30% of his income and put liens on both his cars and his house. Mallory divorced him after 18 months of aggressive collection efforts, claiming she couldn't handle the financial stress. Derek ended up in a cheap apartment working 2 jobs to cover the garnishments and his basic expenses. Mutual friends said he looked 10 years older and never smiled anymore. My mom reported that he'd tried reaching out to her about reconciling with me, and she'd told him that ship had sailed when he spent my insurance money on vacations. I felt no satisfaction hearing about Derek's struggles. His misery didn't restore what I'd lost, but it did prove that actions had consequences even when the system made justice difficult and slow. 5 years after the accident, I attended a support group for trauma survivors. The facilitator asked each person to share what they'd learned from their experience. When my turn came, I talked about surviving impossible odds only to face betrayal by family. I explained how the legal system had given me a victory I couldn't collect, how I'd eventually sold my judgment and used the money to rebuild. A woman across the circle asked if I regretted fighting my brother so hard, if maybe I should have just accepted the situation and moved on. I told her that fighting Derek wasn't about the money, it was about refusing to accept that people could betray you and face no consequences. Even though I never got full justice, Derek knew what he'd done, and carried that weight. Everyone in his life knew what he'd done. That mattered more than dollars in my account. I still get Derek's name as a payment notification occasionally, though now it goes to the insurance company instead of me. They're garnishing his wages for probably another 20 years, taking a percentage of everything he earns. He'll be almost 70 when he finishes paying back what he stole, assuming he lives that long and keeps working. Sometimes I wonder if he thinks about me when those garnishments hit his paychecks. If he remembers spending my life insurance money on luxury vacations and kitchen renovations while I was fighting for my life. If he feels any genuine remorse or just resents me for holding him accountable. I'll probably never know because we haven't spoken since before the trial. Our parents keep us updated on each other's basic life facts, but we're strangers now, brothers only by blood and shared history, not by any meaningful connection. 7 years after the accident that should have killed me, I'm 43 years old and building a life I actually enjoy. I run a successful freelance bookkeeping business from home, working with small businesses and nonprofits. My chronic pain is manageable through physical therapy and medication. I'm in a committed relationship with someone who knows my whole story and loves me anyway. I have savings and stability and friendships built on honesty rather than obligation. Derek took 3 months of my life while I was in a coma, and then $500,000 that should have helped me recover. But he couldn't take my ability to rebuild or my determination to create meaning from suffering. I survived the accident and the betrayal and the legal battle. That survival, more than any judgment or payment, is the justice I gave myself. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.